Before we begin this journey into one of the most disturbing cases ever recorded in the hills of the Missouri Ozarks, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is right now.
Which way did they go? The tracks are
We are
gone,
tracking
sir.
just
We
how
must
far
keep
these
moving.
old stories still reach. The autumn of 1892 settled over the Ozark Mountains like a shroud. The oak and hickory forests painted the hillsides in shades of amber and blood red. Deep in the rugged terrain of Taney County, the isolated settlement of Black Hollow clung to existence like a forgotten outpost on the edge of the known world. 40 souls lived in that hollow. They were tucked between limestone bluffs that rose nearly 300 feet on either side. The only way in was a narrow trail that wound through dense forest, connecting the settlement to the trading post in Forsyth. That was a grueling 25-mile journey through mountain passes that claimed lives every winter. Most folks in Black Hollow had never ventured beyond those trading post walls. They lived according to rhythms established generations before the Civil War. They farmed the thin soil, hunted the abundant game, and kept to themselves in a way that had become second nature to these mountain people. The geography itself created a fortress of solitude. Bull Creek meandered through the valley floor, fed by dozens of springs that emerged from the limestone bedrock. The water was so pure that travelers would detour miles from established routes just to fill their canteens from these mountain sources. Yet that same isolation that provided life-sustaining water also created conditions where families could disappear without notice. Secrets could fester for generations. The line between civilization and wilderness became increasingly blurred. Long before European settlers arrived, various Native American groups had occupied these hollows. Creek and Cherokee hunting parties had used the extensive cave systems as seasonal shelters. They left behind pictographs and artifacts that early settlers found both fascinating and deeply troubling. The ancient markings depicted scenes that seemed to document rituals bearing no resemblance to the religious traditions familiar to Christian settlers. More troubling were the symbols showing human figures undergoing transformations. Their bodies were elongated and distorted in ways that suggested either artistic symbolism or documentation of actual witnessed events. At the heart of this community stood the Mullins family homestead. It was a weathered log structure built by Heinrich Mullins in 1847, when he first claimed the land under the Federal Homestead Acts. Heinrich had arrived in the Ozarks as part of a wave of German immigration. He brought skilled craftsmanship and farming knowledge to the frontier territories. The original cabin he constructed demonstrated sophisticated understanding of local building materials and climate conditions. It incorporated features that would not become common in regional architecture for another generation. By 1892, the property had passed to his son Jacob Mullins. Jacob was 43 years old. He lived there with his wife Martha and their 4 children: Samuel, 19, Rebecca, 17, young Henry, 12, and little Mary, just 8 years old. Jacob had inherited not only his father's land, but also his extensive knowledge of traditional medicine. He had also inherited his collection of books and manuscripts that dealt with subjects rarely discussed openly in frontier communities. The Mullins family library was unusual for such a remote location. Jacob possessed volumes on botany, anatomy, and natural philosophy. These would have been considered advanced, even in established Eastern cities. More intriguing were the handwritten journals and notebooks passed down through generations. These documents contained detailed observations of local plant life, cave systems, and geological formations. The manuscripts revealed a level of systematic investigation that suggested the Mullins viewed their mountain home as more than simply a place to farm. Martha Mullins, born Martha Schneider, had grown up in a similar German immigrant family in the neighboring county. Her education was extensive for a frontier woman. It included literacy in both German and English, basic mathematics, and comprehensive knowledge of herbal medicine and food preservation. She had married Jacob in 1870. Neighbors described the early years of their marriage as remarkably harmonious. Martha was known for her intelligence, her skill in treating injuries and illnesses, and her ability to predict weather patterns with uncanny accuracy. The four Mullins children had been raised with an unusual combination of practical frontier skills and scholarly pursuits. Samuel, the eldest, demonstrated remarkable ability in tracking and hunting. He also showed deep interest in his father's books and manuscripts. He had learned to read and write in both German and English. He possessed knowledge of local geography that surpassed that of much older residents. Rebecca displayed similar intellectual gifts. Her interests focused more on botanical studies and the medicinal properties of native plants. Young Henry and Mary were still developing their individual characteristics. Both showed signs of the family's distinctive combination of practical skills and scholarly inclinations. Henry demonstrated unusual sensitivity to changes in weather and animal behavior. Mary showed remarkable ability to locate water sources and navigate through dense forest without becoming lost. The Mullins family's reputation in Black Hollow was complex. They were respected for their knowledge and skills. They were frequently consulted when neighbors faced medical emergencies or agricultural problems. Yet there was also an undercurrent of unease about the family's activities. They were known to spend considerable time exploring cave systems that other residents avoided. They were rumored to possess knowledge of local history and geography that seemed to exceed what could be learned through normal observation. The first indication that something was wrong came on October 15, 1892. Samuel Mullins failed to return from checking the family's trap lines along Roaring Creek. The boy had left before dawn, as was his custom. He carried his father's old percussion rifle and a small canvas sack for any game he might find. He had also taken with him a leather-bound notebook. In it, he recorded observations about animal behavior and weather patterns. This notebook would later prove to be one of the few tangible clues to his fate. When darkness fell, and he had not returned, Jacob organized a search party. He gathered three neighboring families, the Kellys, the Hoffmans, and the McClures. These were experienced woodsmen who knew every trail and landmark within 15 miles of the hollow. The search began immediately, despite the difficulty of navigating rough terrain in darkness. Torches and lanterns were gathered. The men spread out in a systematic pattern designed to cover the most likely routes Samuel would have taken. They found Samuel's rifle beside the creek. Its barrel was submerged in the shallow water. The weapon showed no signs of damage or struggle. It remained loaded with the original charge Jacob had prepared earlier that morning. His canvas sack lay nearby, torn and empty. The tear pattern suggested deliberate cutting rather than accidental damage. Most disturbing of all was the complete absence of his notebook. Samuel never traveled without it, and it would have been valuable to anyone familiar with its contents. The tracks discovered in the soft mud along the bank defied easy explanation. They would be discussed and debated by residents of the hollow for decades to come. Samuel's boot prints were clearly visible in several locations. They showed that he had moved along the creek bank for some distance before stopping at the spot where his rifle was found. But alongside his tracks were impressions that challenged the observer's understanding of what they were seeing. Old Thomas Kelly, who had tracked game through these mountains for over 50 years, later told the county sheriff that the accompanying prints appeared to be made by bare feet, but they were of unusual size and proportion. The impressions suggested feet that were longer and narrower than normal. They had what appeared to be unusually extended toes. The depth of the impressions indicated someone of considerable weight, perhaps 200 pounds or more. Yet the stride length and gait pattern suggested a much smaller individual. More puzzling still was the discovery of additional print types, indicating the presence of multiple individuals. Some impressions appeared completely normal. They suggested the involvement of at least one person of conventional build and gait. Others showed characteristics that the experienced trackers found impossible to categorize. The arrangement of the various tracks suggested a meeting or gathering had taken place at the creek side. Samuel's movements indicated he had approached willingly rather than under duress. The search continued for 3 days. The initial party expanded to include men from as far away as Branson and Hollister. They found scraps of Samuel's clothing caught on thorny underbrush nearly 2 miles from where his rifle was discovered. The fabric showed no signs of violence or struggle. Instead, the tears appeared to be the result of rapid movement through dense vegetation. It was as if Samuel had been running or moving quickly through areas where normal travel would require careful navigation. The trail of fabric scraps led toward the most remote and difficult terrain in the region. These were areas where even experienced hunters rarely ventured. The dangerous combination of steep cliffs, unstable rock formations, and cave systems could easily trap the unwary. The final piece of Samuel's clothing was found at the base of a sheer rock face. It rose nearly 100 feet above Roaring Creek. The location seemed impossible to reach without specialized climbing equipment. During this period of intensive searching, the behavior of the Mullins family members drew considerable attention. Their neighbors and the volunteers who had come to help watched them closely. While such situations typically brought out strong emotional reactions from family members, the Mullins displayed responses that struck many observers as unusual and troubling. Martha Mullins exhibited behavior that ranged from unnaturally calm to almost detached from the crisis at hand, while other mothers in similar circumstances might have been consumed with grief, anxiety, or frantic activity. She maintained her daily routines with mechanical precision. She continued to prepare meals for the search parties, tend to household tasks, and care for her remaining children as if nothing extraordinary was happening. When directly questioned about Samuel's disappearance, she spoke of him as if he were merely delayed rather than missing. She expressed confidence that he would return when his current activities were completed. More disturbing to the search seminary in Virginia, more disturbing to the search volunteers were Martha's references to knowledge about Samuel's whereabouts that she claimed to have received through dreams and visions. She spoke of communication with her son that occurred during sleep. She described conversations in which he assured her of his safety and explained that he was engaged in important work that prevented his immediate return. These claims were initially dismissed as the wishful thinking of a worried mother. But Martha's detailed descriptions of locations and activities proved remarkably accurate in several instances. When Sheriff Henry Coulson arrived from the county seat in Forsyth, he found a situation that challenged his experience with frontier crises and family emergencies. Sheriff Coulson was a veteran lawman. He had dealt with numerous cases of missing persons, domestic violence, and wilderness accidents during his 15 years in office. He prided himself on his ability to quickly assess situations and determine the most likely explanations for unusual events. His interview with Martha Mullins left him profoundly unsettled. Her responses to his questions were measured, detailed, and internally consistent. But they described a version of events that seemed to exist in a different reality from that experienced by other family members and neighbors. She claimed that Samuel had been preparing for this disappearance for several weeks. He had been gathering supplies and information for what she described as an important journey of discovery. She insisted that his absence was voluntary and purposeful, rather than the result of accident or foul play. More troubling were Martha's references to Samuel's involvement in activities that she described as continuing the work begun by previous inhabitants of the region. She spoke of ancient knowledge preserved in the cave systems of the Hollow. This information had been passed down through generations of people who understood the true nature of the mountain environment. According to Martha, Samuel had demonstrated unusual sensitivity to this hidden knowledge. He had been selected to play a role in preserving and extending it. Sheriff Coulson's attempts to obtain more specific information about these claims proved frustrating. Martha's explanations were detailed and consistent, but they referred to concepts and activities that seemed to have no basis in observable reality. She spoke of communication networks that operated without conventional means. She described knowledge that could be transmitted directly from mind to mind. She referenced discoveries that had been made in the hidden chambers beneath the mountains. The sheriff's interviews with the other Mullins family members revealed additional disturbing information. In the weeks before his disappearance, Rebecca, the eldest daughter, confided that Samuel had been troubled by strange dreams and visions. These began sometime in late August. He had spoken of hearing voices calling to him from the deep woods. These voices seemed to know intimate details about his life and family history. According to Rebecca's account, the voices had provided Samuel with detailed information about the cave systems in the region. They included the locations of chambers and passages that were not marked on any available maps. Samuel had begun making solitary expeditions into these underground areas. He returned with artifacts and specimens that he claimed proved the existence of previous inhabitants. Their knowledge and capabilities, he said, exceeded those of current settlers. Young Henry, despite his youth, provided additional insights into his brother's changing behavior. He reported that Samuel had begun speaking in a language that no one in the family recognized. He carried on extended conversations with individuals who were not visible to other family members. These conversations appeared to be exchanges of information, rather than simple expressions of mental disturbance. Samuel asked questions and apparently received detailed answers about subjects ranging from local history to advanced techniques of agriculture and medicine. The boy also described finding Samuel in various locations around the family property at unusual hours. He often stood motionless in positions that suggested he was listening intently to sounds that others could not hear. On several occasions, Henry had followed his brother into the forest. He watched as Samuel navigated directly to specific locations without reference to trails or landmarks. He moved with confidence through terrain that would have challenged experienced woodsmen. Jacob Mullins's responses to questioning proved equally disturbing, though in different ways from those of his wife. Unlike Martha's calm certainty about Samuel's safety and purpose, Jacob displayed signs of deep anxiety and confusion about his son's disappearance. He acknowledged that Samuel had been acting strangely in recent weeks, but he attributed these changes to the normal stresses of growing up in an isolated environment. He did not believe they were caused by supernatural or unexplained influences. More significantly, Jacob admitted to Sheriff Coulson that the family possessed extensive written records about the history and geography of Black Hollow. This information had been compiled over several generations by various residents and previous inhabitants of the region. According to Jacob, these documents contained detailed maps of cave systems. They included descriptions of artifacts and markings found in underground chambers. They also contained accounts of unusual events and phenomena that had occurred in the area over a period of more than a century. Jacob's reluctance to share these documents with the investigation troubled Sheriff Coulson, but the sheriff lacked legal authority to demand access to private family papers without evidence of criminal activity. Jacob insisted that the materials were fragile and potentially dangerous if misinterpreted. He expressed concern that making them public could lead to treasure hunting and vandalism that would damage important historical sites. The search for Samuel was officially called off on October 19th. The decision came after 4 days of intensive effort by more than 30 volunteers. It was based on the practical reality that the available resources had been exhausted. Further searching would require equipment and expertise that were not available in the region. Sheriff Coulson filed a formal missing person report. He requested assistance from federal authorities, but the remote location and limited evidence made it unlikely that additional resources would be allocated to the case. Jacob Mullins accepted the end of the official search with a stoicism that impressed some observers and disturbed others. He expressed gratitude to the volunteers who had participated. He acknowledged the thorough nature of their efforts, but he showed no signs of the desperation or continuing hope that might be expected from a father in such circumstances. Instead, he spoke of accepting God's will. He trusted that Samuel's fate would ultimately be revealed according to divine timing. As autumn deepened into winter, the Mullins household settled into routines that reflected the absence of their eldest son. But their behavior also suggested a level of preparation and acceptance that seemed inconsistent with the unexpected nature of his disappearance. Samuel's responsibilities were redistributed among the remaining family members. The redistribution happened with an efficiency that suggested prior planning. The family's daily activities continued with minimal disruption. Martha Mullins's behavior during this period became the subject of considerable discussion among the residents of Black Hollow. She began taking long walks alone into the same areas where Samuel had disappeared. She often remained away from the cabin for hours at a time. When questioned about these excursions, she explained that she found peace and clarity in the forest environment. She said her walks helped her maintain spiritual connection with her missing son. These solitary journeys took Martha into terrain that even experienced hunters approached with caution. She demonstrated familiarity with cave entrances and underground passages that were not marked on available maps. She showed knowledge of local geography that exceeded what could have been gained through casual exploration. Neighbors who encountered her during these walks reported that she moved through the difficult terrain with confidence and purpose. She followed routes that seemed to have been carefully planned in advance. More troubling were reports that Martha had been observed in locations, and at times that seemed impossible. The distances involved and the challenging nature of the terrain made her appearances hard to explain. Multiple witnesses claimed to have seen her simultaneously in different parts of the hollow. This led to speculation about whether she was receiving assistance from unknown accomplices, or whether the observers had been mistaken in their identification. Rebecca Mullins, now the eldest child remaining at home, assumed many of her mother's domestic responsibilities. She did this with a maturity that seemed to exceed her 17 years. Neighbors noted that she had developed a serious, almost haunted expression. It replaced her former youthful enthusiasm and curiosity about the world beyond Black Hollow. She rarely spoke unless directly addressed. She began avoiding social gatherings and community activities that had previously brought her enjoyment. The girl's transformation was particularly evident in her relationship with the natural environment around the family homestead. Previously, Rebecca had enjoyed exploring the woods and fields near the cabin. She collected specimens for botanical studies and helped with outdoor work. After Samuel's disappearance, however, she seemed to develop an aversion to venturing far from the immediate vicinity of the house. She showed signs of anxiety when required to travel even short distances into the forest. Young Henry and Mary displayed their own troubling adaptations to the changed circumstances of their family life. Henry became increasingly prone to violent outbursts. He would strike his sister or destroy household items with little apparent provocation. These episodes were followed by periods of complete withdrawal. During these times, he would remain silent and unresponsive for hours at a time. The boy also began showing signs of the unusual sensitivity to environmental conditions that had characterized Samuel's behavior. He predicted weather changes and animal behavior with accuracy that exceeded normal childhood intuition. Mary, the youngest at 8 years old, underwent perhaps the most dramatic transformation of any family member. Previously known as a chatty and curious child, she delighted in asking questions and exploring her surroundings. She became silent and withdrawn. She was often found staring out the cabin windows toward the tree line for extended periods. When she did speak, her comments often referred to conversations she claimed to have with Samuel. She described detailed exchanges that suggested ongoing contact with her missing brother. Winter in the Ozarks during 1892-93 proved particularly harsh. Heavy snows began in late November and continued intermittently through March. The isolation that was already a defining characteristic of Black Hollow became complete. The mountain passes became impassable. Communication with the outside world was reduced to occasional visits by the most determined travelers. Families were forced to rely entirely on their stored provisions, preserved foods, and whatever hunting and trapping could be accomplished, despite the severe weather conditions. It was during this period of enforced isolation that the most disturbing events began to unfold within the Mullins household. The first indication of serious problems came in late December, just days before Christmas. Henry burst into the cabin of their nearest neighbors, the Kellys, in a state of complete hysteria. The boy was barely clothed despite the bitter cold. His feet were bloody from running barefoot through snow that was more than a foot deep in most areas. Henry's account of conditions at his family's cabin was fragmented and difficult to follow. But certain details were consistent and deeply troubling. He claimed that his mother had been undergoing some kind of transformation. It made her increasingly unrecognizable as the person he had known throughout his childhood. According to the boy, Martha spent most of her time in activities that he could not understand or explain. She spoke in languages that none of the family members recognized. She performed tasks that seemed to serve no practical purpose. More distressing were Henry's descriptions of his father's response to these changes. Jacob had apparently become so disturbed by his wife's behavior that he had taken to sleeping in the root cellar beneath the cabin. He emerged only when absolutely necessary for essential tasks such as caring for the livestock or gathering firewood. The boy described his father as existing in a state of constant fear. Jacob was convinced that the woman living in their cabin was no longer his wife. He believed she was some kind of imposter or possessed individual. Thomas Kelly and his adult son William immediately accompanied Henry back to the Mullins homestead. They did this despite the dangerous conditions and their own concerns about what they might encounter there. The journey through the deep snow required more than an hour. They arrived at the cabin as darkness was beginning to fall. The scene they encountered there would be remembered and discussed by both men for the remainder of their lives. The exterior of the cabin appeared entirely normal. Smoke rose peacefully from the chimney. There were no obvious signs of disturbance or violence. However, the interior of the building told a dramatically different story. It challenged the visitors' understanding of what they were witnessing. The main living area had been completely rearranged. Furniture was moved into positions that served no apparent practical purpose. Items that had previously been stored in logical locations were now distributed throughout the room. They followed patterns that seemed to obey some kind of organizational system that the visitors could not comprehend. More disturbing were the various objects and materials that had been added to the room since the Kellys' last visit. Glass containers filled with plant materials and unidentifiable liquids were arranged on every available surface. Each was carefully labeled with symbols that bore no resemblance to any writing system familiar to the visitors. Bundles of dried herbs and roots hung from the rafters. They created a complex network of organic materials that filled the air with strong, unfamiliar scents. Martha Mullins sat in her rocking chair by the fire, but her appearance was so dramatically altered that the Kellys initially failed to recognize her as the woman they had known for more than 20 years. She had lost a considerable amount of weight. Her clothes hung loosely on a frame that seemed to have physically diminished in size. Her hair, once a rich brown and carefully maintained, had grown wild and unkempt. It was streaked with premature gray that made her appear decades older than her actual age. Most disturbing were the changes in her eyes and facial expression. Martha's gaze had taken on an intensity that made direct eye contact extremely uncomfortable. Her facial features seemed somehow sharpened and more angular than before. When she acknowledged the visitors, her voice had acquired a different quality. Her pronunciation and inflection suggested she was speaking English as a second language rather than the native tongue she had used throughout her life in the Hollow. She greeted Thomas and William Kelly by name, but her manner suggested that she was drawing upon memories of their relationship rather than experiencing genuine recognition or emotional connection. When asked about her family's circumstances and Henry's distressed condition, she provided answers that were factually accurate, but she delivered them with a detachment that seemed inconsistent with normal parental concern. More troubling still were her references to Samuel's continuing presence in the household. Martha spoke of her missing son, as if he were physically present. She described recent conversations and shared activities, as if his disappearance had never occurred. When the Kellys attempted to remind her that Samuel had been missing for more than 2 months, she acknowledged their concern, but she insisted that their perception of the situation was based on incomplete information about the true nature of human consciousness and communication. When Thomas Kelly asked about Jacob's whereabouts, Martha simply pointed toward the floor. She indicated the root cellar beneath the cabin. The visitors found Jacob Mullins huddled among the stored vegetables and preserved meats. He was wrapped in blankets and shivering. Despite the relatively warm temperature of the underground space, the man they discovered bore little resemblance to the confident, capable farmer they had known for years. Jacob's physical condition suggested that he had been living in the cellar for an extended period. He was surviving on stored food and water that Rebecca brought down to him through a system of ropes and baskets. His hair had turned completely white. His hands trembled with what might have been cold fear, or some combination of both conditions. Most significantly, he seemed to have aged years in the span of months. His face was marked by deep lines and an expression of perpetual anxiety. Jacob's explanation of his living situation made little coherent sense to his visitors. But his terror was genuine and profound. He claimed that the woman living above them in the cabin was no longer his wife. He believed she was some kind of replacement or transformed version of Martha. She possessed knowledge and capabilities that no normal human being could have acquired. He spoke of hearing her conducting conversations with multiple individuals during the night. This happened despite the fact that no visitors had been observed coming or going from the isolated homestead. More disturbing were Jacob's accounts of discovering evidence that Martha was conducting activities that seemed to require knowledge of chemistry, botany, and other subjects that she had never studied. He described finding complex apparatus and materials that appeared to be related to some kind of systematic research or experimentation. This work was being conducted according to principles and procedures that exceeded his understanding. Jacob also reported that Martha had begun demonstrating abilities that seemed to transcend normal human limitations. She appeared to know about events occurring in distant locations without access to information through conventional means. She showed familiarity with the extensive cave systems beneath Black Hollow. This familiarity could only have been acquired through years of systematic exploration. Most troubling of all, she seemed to be in communication with individuals who were not physically present. She conducted detailed conversations that suggested access to sources of knowledge that existed outside the normal boundaries of human experience. The Kellys attempted to persuade both Jacob and Martha to accept assistance from the community, but neither seemed capable of acknowledging that their situation was abnormal or problematic. Jacob insisted that he was safer in the root cellar. He said that any attempt to interfere with Martha's activities would result in consequences that he could not adequately describe. Martha acknowledged their concern, but she maintained that their perception of the situation was based on misunderstanding about the nature of her current work and responsibilities. Young Rebecca could be observed occasionally peering around corners and moving through the shadows of the cabin, but she avoided direct contact with the visitors. She seemed to exist in a state of constant anxiety about her family's circumstances. When Thomas Kelly attempted to speak with her directly, she fled to areas of the cabin where the visitors could not follow. This suggested that she had been instructed to avoid contact with outsiders. Most mysterious of all was the complete absence of young Mary. She could not be located despite thorough searching of the cabin and immediate vicinity. When asked about the child's whereabouts, Martha provided vague responses. She suggested that Mary was safe and well cared for, but occupied with activities that required privacy and concentration. Jacob, when questioned separately, admitted that he had not seen his youngest daughter for several weeks. He expressed profound concern about her fate. Disturbed by what they had witnessed, the Kellys convinced Henry to return with them to their own cabin. There he could be properly fed and cared for while they determined what action to take regarding his family's situation. The boy proved to be their primary source of information about the deteriorating conditions in the Mullins household. His accounts were often so disturbing that the adults found them difficult to believe or accept. According to Henry, the changes in his mother had begun gradually in the weeks following Samuel's disappearance, but they had accelerated dramatically as winter deepened and the family's isolation became complete. Martha had started spending increasing amounts of time studying the collection of books and manuscripts that had been passed down through generations of the Mullins family. She focused particularly on materials that dealt with subjects related to natural history, geology, and what Henry described as underground knowledge. The boy reported that Martha had begun making regular expeditions into cave systems, located within walking distance of the family homestead. She returned with various materials and specimens. She processed and stored them according to procedures that seemed to follow systematic, scientific principles. These activities were conducted primarily during daylight hours, while the children were occupied with their own responsibilities. But Henry had occasionally observed his mother's work from concealed positions. More troubling were Henry's accounts of nighttime activities that he had witnessed from his sleeping area in the cabin's loft. He claimed that Martha regularly left the cabin after the family was supposed to be asleep. She remained away for hours at a time. She did this despite the dangerous winter conditions and the complete darkness that prevailed in the hollow during the long winter nights. On several occasions, he had observed his mother's departure and returned through the small window near his bed. He noted that she moved through the difficult terrain with confidence. This suggested extensive familiarity with routes that would challenge even experienced outdoorsmen during daylight hours. Even more disturbing were Henry's claims about visitors to the cabin during the night hours. He reported seeing figures approaching the homestead after dark. These individuals moved through the snow without leaving the deep tracks that would normally be expected. They appeared to communicate with Martha through methods that did not involve normal speech. Their meetings sometimes continued for hours before they departed as silently as they had arrived. The boy's descriptions of these mysterious visitors were fragmented and inconsistent, but certain details appeared repeatedly in his accounts. He described individuals who seemed to be unusually tall and thin. They moved with a gliding motion that did not appear entirely natural. They wore clothing that provided no apparent protection against the severe winter weather, yet seemed unaffected by the cold conditions. Most significantly, Henry claimed that these visitors brought with them various items that Martha incorporated into her ongoing activities and experiments. He described seeing boxes, containers, and wrapped packages that were exchanged during these nighttime meetings. These materials were later stored in areas of the cabin and root cellar that had been designated for Martha's exclusive use. The Kellys were faced with a dilemma common to isolated frontier communities, but it was nonetheless challenging to resolve satisfactorily. The nearest law enforcement was located in Forsyth, more than 25 miles away. The journey required travel through mountain terrain that was essentially impassable during winter conditions. Moreover, they were uncertain whether any laws were being violated by the strange behavior they had witnessed. A woman conducting unusual experiments and a man hiding in his root cellar might represent a domestic crisis, but they hardly constituted clear evidence of criminal activity. The mysterious nighttime visitors could be explained as neighbors providing assistance or conducting trade that was kept private for personal reasons. Even the dramatic changes in Martha's appearance and behavior might be attributed to the stress of losing a child. The hardships of frontier life during a particularly severe winter could also explain them. After considerable discussion, the Kellys decided to seek guidance from Reverend Isaiah Morris. He was a circuit preacher who made regular rounds through the region. He was scheduled to visit Black Hollow during the third week of January. Reverend Morris had dealt with similar situations in other remote communities. He possessed both the authority and experience necessary to determine appropriate courses of action. In the meantime, they agreed to provide care for Henry. They would monitor the situation at the Mullins homestead as closely as possible given the weather conditions and the family's apparent desire for privacy. They also sent word to other families in the hollow. They requested that they remain alert for any signs of additional problems or emergency situations that might require community response. The weeks that followed proved to be among the most difficult and disturbing in the memory of Black Hollow's longtime residents. The severe weather continued, making travel and communication extremely hazardous. But reports began to circulate about unusual activities and phenomena that seemed to center around the general area of the Mullins property. Several neighbors reported seeing lights moving through the forest during the nighttime hours. The illumination appeared too bright and too consistent to be explained by torches or lanterns. These lights seemed to follow regular patterns. They moved along routes that connected various cave entrances and other significant geographical features in the region. The lights were observed on multiple nights by different families. This suggested systematic activity rather than random or accidental phenomena. More disturbing were reports of sounds echoing through the hollow during the early morning hours. This was particularly true in the time just before dawn. These sounds were described as resembling human voices, but they spoke in languages that none of the listeners could identify. The voices seemed to carry clearly through the winter air, despite apparent distances that should have made such communication impossible. They sometimes continued for hours at a time. Thomas Kelly, who possessed the most extensive knowledge of local wildlife and natural phenomena, investigated these reports as thoroughly as conditions permitted. His observations confirmed that the sounds were not produced by any known animal species in the region. Their characteristics suggested human vocal cords producing organized speech patterns. However, the acoustic properties of the sounds indicated that they were originating from locations that seemed impossible to reach during winter conditions. Additional disturbing evidence came from tracking expeditions that several residents attempted. They undertook these during brief periods when weather conditions permitted safe travel. The snow cover that blanketed the hollow throughout the winter months should have preserved clear evidence of any movement through the area. Yet the tracks that were discovered defied easy interpretation. Numerous paths through the snow showed evidence of regular use by multiple individuals. Yet these routes connected areas that were separated by terrain features that should have made travel extremely difficult or impossible. More puzzling still, the footprint impressions showed characteristics that seemed inconsistent with any known types of footwear or foot coverings used by local residents. Some tracks appeared to have been made by individuals who were barefoot despite the freezing temperatures. Others suggested footwear that was larger and differently shaped than any boots or shoes familiar to local residents. Most troubling were impressions that seemed to show individuals moving across snow-covered terrain without sinking to the depth that would be expected. This was given the soft, powdery nature of the snow cover. When Reverend Isaiah Morris finally arrived in Black Hollow on January 18, 1893, he found a community struggling to make sense of events. These events seemed to challenge their understanding of normal human behavior and natural phenomena. Reverend Morris was a man of considerable education and experience. He had served frontier communities throughout Missouri and Arkansas for more than 15 years. He had dealt with cases involving mental illness, domestic violence, and various forms of religious extremism. He was not easily disturbed by unusual circumstances or behavior. His initial meeting with the community leaders and the Kelly family provided him with a comprehensive overview of the situation. But he insisted on conducting his own independent investigation before drawing any conclusions about appropriate courses of action. His first priority was to interview Henry directly. He needed to assess the boy's mental and physical condition. He also needed to obtain first-hand accounts of the events he had witnessed. Henry's testimony to Reverend Morris was detailed, consistent, and deeply disturbing. The boy described a systematic transformation of his family that had begun shortly after Samuel's disappearance. It had accelerated throughout the winter months. According to his account, this transformation involved not only changes in behavior and appearance. It also involved the acquisition of knowledge and capabilities that seemed to exceed normal human limitations. The Reverend was particularly troubled by Henry's descriptions of his mother's activities. He was also troubled by the apparent sources of the information and material she was using in her work. The boy claimed that Martha had gained access to written records and documents. These contained detailed information about the history and geography of Black Hollow. They seem to have been created by previous inhabitants of the region whose identity and fate remained unknown. These documents, according to Henry, included maps of cave systems that extended far beyond what had been explored by current residents. They also included detailed descriptions of chambers and passages that contained artifacts and markings left by earlier occupants. More significantly, the materials apparently provided instructions for various procedures and experiments. Martha was attempting to implement these using local plants and minerals. Henry also described his mother's apparent ability to communicate with individuals who were not physically present. She conducted extended conversations that seemed to involve the exchange of complex information. The subjects ranged from local history to advanced techniques of medicine and chemistry. These communications appeared to occur both during Martha's solitary expeditions into the cave systems. They also occurred during the nighttime meetings with mysterious visitors that the boy had observed from his concealed vantage point in the cabin's loft. Reverend Morris's second priority was to attempt direct communication with the Mullins family members. He focused particularly on Martha and Jacob. This proved to be more challenging than he had anticipated. Neither individual seemed willing or able to engage in conventional social interaction. Martha acknowledged his presence and his role as a religious authority, but her responses to his questions and counseling attempts suggested that she viewed their conversation from a perspective that differed fundamentally from normal human relationships and concerns. Most troubling to the Reverend was Martha's apparent knowledge of events and information that she could not possibly have obtained through conventional means. During their conversation, she accurately described recent occurrences in communities throughout the region. These included births, deaths, marriages, and other significant events in places she had never visited and with people she had never met. More disturbing still were her references to historical events and geographical features that were not recorded in any available documents or maps. Martha spoke with authority about the activities of Native American groups who had inhabited the region centuries before European settlement. She described their customs, beliefs, and fate with specificity. This suggested access to first-hand accounts or written records that had never been made public. She also demonstrated detailed knowledge of the extensive cave systems that honeycombed the limestone bedrock beneath Black Hollow. She described chambers and passages that were not marked on any available maps. She provided accurate directions to locations that would have required years of systematic exploration to discover. When Reverend Morris asked how she had acquired this information, Martha's explanations referred to sources of knowledge that operated outside the normal boundaries of human communication and learning. Jacob Mullins's interview with the Reverend proved equally disturbing, though for different reasons. The man, who had once been known as a capable farmer and respected member of the community, had been reduced to a state of constant terror and confusion. He spoke of his wife as if she were a stranger who had somehow replaced the woman he had married. He described changes in her personality, knowledge, and capabilities that exceeded what could be explained through normal processes of human development or adaptation. Most significantly, Jacob claimed that Martha now possessed access to information and abilities that no individual could have acquired through conventional study or experience. He described witnessing her perform procedures and experiments that required knowledge of chemistry, botany, and medicine that she had never formally studied. Yet her work demonstrated understanding that would have been impressive even in someone with advanced academic training. Jacob also reported that Martha seemed to be in regular communication with individuals who were not physically present. She conducted detailed conversations that involved the exchange of complex technical information about subjects he could not understand. These communications occurred both during her solitary work periods and during the mysterious nighttime meetings that Henry had described. This suggested a network of contacts that operated through methods that defied conventional explanation. Perhaps most troubling of all were Jacob's claims about changes in the physical environment around their homestead. He described discovering modifications to cave entrances and underground passages that appeared to have been made recently. Yet the work would have required tools and techniques that were not available to local residents. These modifications seemed designed to facilitate access to previously unexplored areas of the cave systems. They created a network of connected chambers that extended far beneath the surface of Black Hollow. Reverend Morris spent several additional days in the hollow. He attempted to gather more information about the situation. He consulted with community leaders about possible courses of action. However, his investigation was hampered by the severe winter conditions. It was also hampered by the apparent reluctance of the Mullins family to accept outside assistance or intervention. His final attempt to counsel the family directly took place on January 25, 1893. He made the difficult journey through deep snow to visit the Mullins homestead. He was accompanied by Thomas Kelly and 2 other community leaders. What they encountered there exceeded even their worst expectations. It would provide the foundation for rumors and speculation that persisted in the region for generations. The exterior of the cabin showed signs of recent activity that seemed inconsistent with the family's isolated circumstances. Fresh paths through the snow connected the main building to various outbuildings and cave entrances. Yet these paths showed evidence of use by multiple individuals whose identities remained unknown. More puzzling were the tracks that led to and from the homestead. These impressions suggested regular visits by people who were not members of the immediate community. The interior of the cabin had been further transformed since the Kellys' previous visit. Additional materials and equipment had been added. These seemed to serve purposes related to Martha's ongoing activities and experiments. The main living area now resembled a combination of laboratory and workshop. Glass containers, measuring devices, and preserved specimens were arranged according to organizational principles that the visitors could not comprehend. Martha's appearance had continued to deteriorate. Her physical condition suggested malnutrition or illness. This was despite the apparent abundance of preserved food and other supplies in the household. Her behavior during the visit was polite but distant. It was as if she were receiving strangers, rather than neighbors and religious authorities who had known her for years. Most disturbing were her references to work and responsibilities. She described these as being of vital importance, not only to her family, but to the broader community and region. The visitors were unable to locate Jacob during this visit. Martha assured them that he was safe and well cared for. When pressed for more specific information about his whereabouts, she explained that he was engaged in activities that required privacy and concentration. She said this work was essential to the success of the projects she was pursuing. Her calm certainty about his condition contrasted sharply with the evidence of his terror and confusion. The visitors had witnessed this during their previous encounter. Young Rebecca made a brief appearance during the visit, but her condition alarmed the community leaders, even more than her mother's transformation had done. The girl appeared to have lost a considerable amount of weight. Her eyes showed the kind of exhaustion that suggested prolonged sleep deprivation or extreme stress. Most troubling was her apparent inability or unwillingness to communicate directly with the visitors. She responded to questions only through gestures or single-word answers. These provided little useful information. The complete absence of young Mary remained unexplained and deeply troubling to all the visitors. Martha's assurances that the child was safe and well cared for were contradicted by the obvious distress of the other family members. They were also contradicted by the increasingly disturbing evidence of activities that seemed to involve risks that no responsible parent would expose a young child to. Reverend Morris left Black Hollow on January 27, 1893. He had serious concerns about the welfare of the Mullins family and the safety of the broader community. In his official report to church authorities, he recommended immediate intervention by law enforcement and medical professionals, but he acknowledged that the remote location and severe weather conditions made such intervention extremely difficult to arrange or implement. More troubling was his private assessment of the situation. He recorded this in personal journals that were not discovered until after his death many years later. In these private writings, Reverend Morris expressed doubts about his ability to understand or address the forces that seemed to be operating in Black Hollow. He described encountering evidence of knowledge and capabilities that exceeded his experience with normal human behavior. He suggested that the situation might require forms of intervention that went beyond conventional religious or legal remedies. February 1893 brought no improvement to the Mullins family's circumstances. If anything, the situation appeared to be deteriorating more rapidly as the winter progressed toward its end. The severe weather that had isolated Black Hollow throughout the winter months began to show signs of breaking. There were occasional periods of milder temperature and reduced snowfall. These allowed for limited travel and communication with the outside world. It was during one of these brief respites in the weather that the most dramatic and disturbing events of the entire crisis finally occurred. On February 22, 1893, Rebecca Mullins appeared at the Kelly homestead in the early morning hours. Her nightgown was torn and bloodied. Her feet were bare despite the frozen ground. She was in a state of complete hysteria. She was barely able to communicate coherently, but she desperately attempted to convey that something terrible had occurred at her family's cabin. Rebecca's fragmented account of the events of that night would later prove to be the most detailed first-hand testimony available. It described the final stages of the Mullins family's ordeal. According to her description, she had been awakened before dawn by sounds of struggle and violence. The sounds came from the main living area of the cabin. When she investigated, She found her mother engaged in what appeared to be a violent confrontation. Martha was fighting with multiple individuals whose identities remained unclear in the darkness. The girl claimed that these individuals were not members of the local community. They seemed to be the mysterious visitors who had been coming to the cabin throughout the winter months. However, their behavior during this final encounter was markedly different from the peaceful meetings that Henry had described in his earlier testimony. Instead of the quiet, systematic exchange of information and materials that had characterized previous visits, this gathering involved loud arguments and physical struggle. Rebecca described attempts by the visitors to remove items and materials from the cabin against Martha's wishes. Most terrifying to Rebecca was her mother's response to this confrontation. Martha appeared to have gained physical strength and capabilities that exceeded normal human limitations. She defended her possessions and territory with a ferocity that seemed impossible for someone in her weakened physical condition. The girl described witnessing her mother overpower multiple adult opponents. She used techniques and weapons that she could not have learned through normal training or experience. The confrontation apparently ended with the departure of the mysterious visitors, but not before they had succeeded in removing a significant portion of the materials and equipment that Martha had been using in her experiments and research. More disturbing still was Rebecca's account of her mother's behavior following this encounter. Martha had apparently suffered some kind of breakdown or transformation. It left her unable to recognize her daughter or respond to attempts at communication. In her confused and terrified state, Martha had apparently mistaken Rebecca for one of the individuals who had been attempting to steal her materials. She attacked the girl with the same violent intensity she had displayed during the confrontation with the actual intruders. Rebecca had managed to escape only by fleeing into the winter night. She ran through deep snow and dangerous terrain to reach the safety of the Kelly homestead. William Kelly immediately organized a group of men to investigate the Mullins cabin. They attempted to rescue any family members who might still be in danger. The party included Thomas Kelly, Reverend Morris, who was still in the area, and 3 other community leaders. These men had experience with emergency situations and crisis intervention. They made the difficult journey through the snow. They arrived at the homestead as the sun was beginning to rise. What they found would prove to be one of the most disturbing crime scenes in the history of the Missouri Ozarks. The exterior of the cabin showed clear evidence of the violent struggle that Rebecca had described. The snow around the building was trampled and disturbed. There were what appeared to be bloodstains and other signs of physical conflict. More puzzling were the tracks leading away from the cabin. These impressions seemed to indicate the departure of multiple individuals, but they did not match the footprint patterns of anyone known to be living in the region. The interior of the cabin had been completely destroyed. The destruction suggested both systematic searching and violent rage. Furniture had been overturned and smashed. Dishes and household items had been broken and scattered throughout the rooms. The carefully organized materials that Martha had been using in her experiments had been either removed or destroyed. Most disturbing of all were the strange symbols that had been carved into the wooden walls. These markings appeared to have been made during the violent struggle. They seemed to follow patterns similar to those found in the cave systems of the region. Jacob Mullins was discovered in the root cellar, but his condition made it clear that he had not survived the events of the previous night. The nature of his injuries was such that Dr. Samuel Morrison, the physician summoned from Forsyth to examine the scene, declined to provide specific details in his official report. He noted only that the death appeared to be the result of extreme violence. The injuries were inconsistent with any form of accident or self-inflicted wound. More troubling still was the complete absence of both Martha and young Mary. Despite thorough searching of the cabin and the immediate surrounding area, no trace of either individual could be found. The tracks leading away from the homestead were followed as far as conditions permitted, but they vanished at the rocky outcropping, where Samuel's trail had ended months earlier. This suggested some connection between the current disappearances and the original mystery that had begun the family's ordeal. The official investigation that followed was conducted by Sheriff Henry Coulson. He was assisted by deputies from the state capitol and a team of investigators who specialized in violent crimes and missing persons cases. However, the remote location, the severe weather conditions, and the unusual nature of the evidence made their work extremely difficult and ultimately inconclusive. The investigators were able to confirm that Jacob Mullins had been murdered. They confirmed that Martha and Mary Mullins were missing under circumstances that suggested either voluntary departure or abduction. However, the physical evidence at the scene raised more questions than it answered. The testimony of the surviving witnesses was so unusual that it challenged the investigators' ability to develop coherent theories about what had actually occurred. Most puzzling was the apparent sophistication of the activities that had been taking place in the cabin prior to the final violent confrontation. The laboratory equipment and research materials that had been partially destroyed or removed suggested systematic scientific work. This work would have required education and resources that Martha Mullins could not possibly have possessed. The carved symbols found throughout the cabin matched markings discovered in various cave systems throughout the region. This indicated connections to a broader network of activities and individuals whose identity remained unknown. Chemical analysis of residues found in the destroyed laboratory equipment revealed compounds and substances that were not native to the Missouri region. They could not have been easily obtained through normal commercial channels. Some of the materials appeared to be derived from plants that grew only in distant geographical areas. Others showed characteristics that suggested synthetic production using techniques that were extremely advanced for the time period. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the discovery of human remains in various stages of preservation. These materials appeared to have been used in Martha's experimental work, but their origin could not be determined through available investigative techniques. The condition and treatment of these remains suggested knowledge of anatomy and chemistry. This knowledge would have been remarkable even among trained medical professionals of the era. The investigation officially concluded in April 1893. Jacob Mullins's death was classified as murder by unknown perpetrators. Martha and Mary Mullins were listed as missing persons. Warrants were issued for Martha's arrest in connection with her husband's death, but the lack of clear evidence about her whereabouts or the circumstances of her disappearance made any meaningful pursuit impossible. Rebecca Mullins was placed in the care of distant relatives in Springfield, Missouri. She remained there for the rest of her short life. Those who knew her during her final years described a young woman who had been permanently marked by her experiences in Black Hollow. She rarely spoke about her family or the events she had witnessed. When she did discuss her past, her accounts were often fragmented and contradictory. Medical professionals who examined Rebecca noted signs of severe psychological trauma. The trauma seemed to go beyond what would normally be expected, even from someone who had experienced the violent death of a family member. She displayed symptoms that suggested exposure to experiences that had challenged her fundamental understanding of reality. She never fully recovered the ability to form normal social relationships or function independently in conventional society. Rebecca's death in 1901, at the age of 25, was officially attributed to consumption. But physicians who treated her during her final illness noted unusual characteristics in her condition. They found these difficult to explain through conventional medical knowledge. She had apparently maintained correspondence with unknown individuals throughout her years in Springfield. She received letters and packages that she never discussed with her caretakers or relatives. More intriguingly, Rebecca had apparently continued to demonstrate some of the unusual abilities that had characterized other members of her family. She showed remarkable knowledge of events occurring in distant locations. She possessed understanding of natural phenomena and scientific principles that exceeded what could have been learned through normal education or experience. After Rebecca's death, her personal possessions were examined by relatives. They hoped to gain insights into her experiences and perhaps locate other surviving family members. Among her belongings were found journals, letters, and various artifacts. These provided the most detailed account available of the Mullins family's activities and the forces that had ultimately destroyed them. These documents revealed that the family's involvement with the mysterious knowledge and capabilities that had led to their downfall had begun much earlier than previously suspected. According to Rebecca's private writings, the Mullins had been part of a network of individuals and families throughout the Ozark region. They had been working to preserve and extend ancient forms of knowledge. They believed this knowledge had been possessed by previous inhabitants of the area. This network apparently operated through a combination of written communication and direct meetings. These were carefully concealed from the broader community. Members shared information about discoveries made in cave systems, artifacts, and markings. These provided clues to the activities of earlier peoples. They also shared techniques for accessing forms of consciousness and perception that transcended normal human limitations. Samuel's disappearance, according to Rebecca's account, had not been accidental. It had represented a planned transition to a different level of involvement with this hidden knowledge. He had been selected based on his demonstrated sensitivity to the forces and influences that the network was studying. His apparent disappearance had actually been a form of graduation. It led to activities that required complete separation from conventional society. Martha's transformation throughout the winter of 1892 to 93 had been the result of her attempts to follow Samuel's path. She sought to achieve the same level of integration with the hidden knowledge that the network preserved. However, her efforts had been opposed by factions within the network. They believed that she was moving too quickly. They thought she was taking risks that threatened the security of their broader activities. The violent confrontation that had resulted in Jacob's death and the destruction of the cabin had been the climax of a struggle between these competing factions. Martha ultimately chose to join Samuel, rather than submit to the limitations that her opponents sought to impose upon her work. Mary's disappearance suggested that she had been taken along on this journey. She might have been a participant or a hostage whose fate remained tied to her family's ultimate destiny. Rebecca's journals also provided detailed information about the locations and contents of various cave systems throughout the Black Hollow region. This information had been gathered over several generations by network members. They had systematically explored and documented the underground chambers and passages. These caves apparently contained extensive collections of artifacts, written records, and preserved materials. They documented the activities of peoples whose civilization had achieved levels of knowledge and capability that exceeded those of contemporary American society. Most significantly, Rebecca's writings suggested that the network's activities were continuing despite the tragic fate of her family. Other individuals and groups were carrying on the work of exploration, documentation, and practical application of the hidden knowledge. She provided names, locations, and coded communication methods. These indicated an organization of considerable scope and sophistication. It had managed to operate for decades without detection by authorities or outsiders. The discovery of Rebecca's documents prompted a new investigation. Dr. Edmund Hartwell, a professor of anthropology from Washington University, had been studying folklore and legends of the Ozark region. Dr. Hartwell recognized that the materials provided unprecedented insights. They revealed forms of knowledge and social organization that had previously been dismissed as superstition or imagination. His investigation, conducted between 1901 and 1905, involved systematic exploration of the cave systems identified in Rebecca's journals. He also attempted to locate and interview other members of the network she had described. This work was extremely dangerous due to the remote locations involved. It was also dangerous due to the apparent hostility of network members toward outside interference. But Dr. Hartwell's findings revolutionized understanding of the cultural and historical significance of the Ozark region. The cave systems explored by Dr. Hartwell's team contained evidence of continuous human habitation and activities spanning several centuries. This included extensive modifications to natural chambers and passages. These demonstrated sophisticated engineering and construction techniques. More remarkable were the collections of written materials, scientific instruments, and preserved specimens that had been maintained in these underground locations. They represented a level of systematic research and documentation that rivaled the work of major academic institutions. Chemical analysis of materials found in the caves revealed compounds and substances that were not native to North America. They could not be easily explained through known trade relationships or communication networks. Some materials appeared to have been synthesized using techniques that were extremely advanced for the historical periods in which they had apparently been created. This suggested access to scientific knowledge that exceeded what was generally available to American society during the 19th century. Most intriguing were the extensive written records found in various cave locations. These documents provided detailed accounts of the activities and discoveries made by network members over several generations. The records described systematic study of natural phenomena. They described development of techniques for enhancing human consciousness and perception. They described practical applications of knowledge that seemed to derive from sources outside conventional European or American intellectual traditions. The written materials also documented communication and cooperation between network groups in different geographical regions. This indicated an organization that extended far beyond the Missouri Ozarks. It had maintained coordination despite the isolation and independence of its constituent communities. References were found to similar groups operating in remote areas of Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky, and other states. This suggested a network of remarkable scope and persistence. Dr. Hartwell's team also discovered evidence that the network had maintained detailed records of contacts with peoples whose cultural and technological development exceeded that of mainstream American society. These contacts appeared to have provided access to knowledge and techniques. They formed the foundation for much of the network's activities. The identity and location of these advanced peoples remained unclear from available documentation. Perhaps most significantly, the cave explorations revealed ongoing evidence of current activity. This suggested that the network had survived the various crises and disruptions that had affected individual families and communities, like the Mullins. Fresh modifications to cave systems, recently deposited materials and supplies, and maintenance of equipment and facilities indicated that the work was continuing. This was happening despite the losses and setbacks that had occurred. Dr. Hartwell attempted to make contact with current network members, but these efforts were unsuccessful. They may have resulted in increased security measures that made further investigation more difficult. His final report, completed in 1905, documented the remarkable scope and sophistication of the organization he had discovered. But he acknowledged that many questions about its current activities and ultimate objectives remained unanswered. The report was initially classified by university authorities. They were concerned about public reaction and potential safety issues related to the remote cave systems. However, copies were provided to federal agencies and academic institutions that specialized in anthropological and archaeological research. This led to additional investigations that continued sporadically throughout the early decades of the 20th century. These subsequent investigations confirmed and extended Dr. Hartwell's findings. They revealed that the network had indeed survived and continued to operate. This happened despite increased attention from outside authorities. Evidence was found of systematic expansion into new geographical areas. There was development of more sophisticated communication and coordination methods. There was continued advancement in the practical application of the knowledge and techniques that formed the foundation of their activities. More troubling to investigators were indications that network members had begun to achieve levels of capability and integration with their hidden knowledge. These exceeded what previous generations had accomplished. Reports began to circulate of individuals who demonstrated abilities that seemed to transcend normal human limitations. These included enhanced sensory perception, resistance to environmental extremes, and forms of communication that operated without conventional technological assistance. By the 1920s, federal authorities had become sufficiently concerned about the network's activities. They initiated systematic surveillance and investigation efforts. However, these official programs proved largely unsuccessful. The network's sophisticated security measures made them hard to penetrate. The extreme difficulty of operating in the remote areas where their activities were concentrated also hindered efforts. The few investigators who managed to penetrate network security and observe their activities directly returned with accounts that were so unusual that they were often dismissed as exaggeration or imagination. These reports described underground facilities that demonstrated technological capabilities far in advance of what was generally available. They described individuals who appeared to have undergone physical and mental modifications. These modifications enhanced their abilities beyond normal human ranges. They described evidence of communication with groups or entities whose nature and location remained completely unknown. During the 1930s and 1940s, the network's activities appeared to decline or become even more carefully concealed. This was possibly in response to increased government attention. It was also possibly due to the disruptions caused by economic depression and World War. However, occasional reports continued to surface of unusual phenomena and unexplained events in remote areas of the Ozarks. These occurred in other regions where network activity had previously been documented. The development of more advanced investigative techniques during the post-war period led to renewed official interest in the network and its activities. However, attempts to locate and study the cave systems and facilities that had been documented in earlier investigations. Often found that these sites had been abandoned, concealed, or deliberately destroyed. This was done to prevent outside access. In 1965, Dr. Patricia Wells of the University of Missouri undertook the most comprehensive investigation of the network's history and current status. This was the most extensive attempt since Dr. Hartwell's work 60 years earlier. Her research benefited from access to previously classified government documents. She used advanced archaeological techniques that provided new insights into the scope and significance of the organization's activities. Dr. Wells's investigation confirmed that the network had indeed survived the various disruptions and challenges of the 20th century. Its current form and activities appeared to differ significantly from what had been documented in earlier periods. Evidence suggested that the organization had adapted to changing conditions. It had become more decentralized and technologically sophisticated. It used methods that made detection and investigation by outside authorities increasingly difficult. More significantly, Dr. Wells discovered indications that the network's long-term objectives involved preparation for changes in human society and environmental conditions. They believed these changes were inevitable and necessary. References were found to plans and preparations that seemed designed to preserve and protect certain forms of knowledge and capability. These were intended to survive periods of social and technological disruption that the network anticipated in the future. The implications of these discoveries were so significant that Dr. Wells's final report was immediately classified by federal authorities. It has never been released for public review. However, portions of her research were incorporated into government planning documents related to emergency preparedness and national security. This suggested that official agencies took the network's capabilities and objectives seriously. Today, nearly 130 years after the tragic events that destroyed the Mullins family, the Black Hollow region remains largely unchanged from its condition in the 1890s. The area has been designated as protected wilderness. This ensures that casual exploration and development are prevented. It preserves whatever secrets the region may still hold. Occasional reports continue to surface of unusual phenomena observed in the area. These include unexplained lights, sounds, and evidence of human activity in locations that are supposed to be uninhabited. These reports are generally dismissed as natural phenomena or the imagination of hikers and hunters. But their persistence suggests that some form of activity may indeed be continuing in the remote cave systems and hidden facilities of the region. The official records of the Mullins family tragedy and the subsequent investigations are preserved in various government and academic archives. Access to much of this material remains restricted. The story has largely faded from public memory. It is remembered primarily by local historians and researchers who specialize in the folklore and legends of the Ozark region. However, for those who have studied the documented evidence and explored the implications of what was discovered, the Black Hollow case represents far more than an isolated frontier tragedy. The systematic nature of the activities documented over more than a century is remarkable. The sophistication of the knowledge and techniques involved is striking. The apparent continuation of the work, despite various disruptions and challenges, suggests an organization of remarkable persistence and capability. The possibility that such groups continue to operate in remote areas of the American wilderness is troubling. They pursue objectives that transcend the goals and understanding of mainstream society. This raises fundamental questions about the nature of human potential. It also raises questions about the forms of knowledge that may exist outside conventional academic and scientific institutions. whether the network's activities represent a beneficial preservation of ancient wisdom, a dangerous pursuit of power that threatens social stability, or something else entirely remains unclear from available evidence. What is certain is that the story of Martha Mullins and her family's tragic fate provides a glimpse into forms of human achievement and organization. These continue to operate beyond the boundaries of official knowledge and public awareness. The mountains and forests of Missouri continue to guard their secrets. But the documented evidence suggests that those secrets involve capabilities and knowledge that may prove to be of crucial importance to humanity's future development. The Black Hollow case serves as a reminder that even in our modern age of global communication and scientific advancement, there remain aspects of human experience and potential that we are only beginning to understand. Perhaps someday, when society has developed the wisdom and capability to safely approach these hidden forms of knowledge, the sealed caves and secret facilities of the Ozark Mountains will be opened. Their contents will be fully examined. Until then, they remain as Martha Mullins left them more than a century ago. They are repositories of human achievement that exceeded the understanding of their time. They continue to wait for future generations with the courage and vision to unlock their secrets. The hollow remains silent now. Its mysteries are preserved beneath layers of stone and government classification. But the wind that moves through the ancient trees still carries echoes of the knowledge and capabilities that were once pursued there. They were pursued by individuals whose vision extended far beyond the boundaries of their historical moment. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think happened to Martha and Mary? Have you ever heard stories like this from your own region? We would love to hear from you. And remember, the mountains keep their secrets. But sometimes, just sometimes, the secrets find their way out.